I would love to introduce the group to Professor Sewell. She is the Senior Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at Stanford GSB, which will become relevant in this conversation because she's living a lot of these leadership challenges right now, and she'll talk more about that. She's also the Morgridge Professor of Organizational Behavior, so it's both theory as well as practice day to day. We're so excited to also have her as our faculty director for the program that we partner on together with ExecOnline, Leading Through Personal Excellence. With that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you and to talk a little bit about inclusive leadership in turbulent times. And what I really want to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about the differential impact of COVID-19, but then also, probably more to the point, introduce a framework for thinking about leadership in these strange and unusual and turbulent times that we all find ourselves. Right now, as leaders, you're expected to fix problems and find answers and find solutions and ensure that the people that you work with are feeling safe and feeling that they can make it through this particular pandemic and this period, which is unsure. We're unsure how long this is going to last. But if you're feeling anxious and untethered, it's for good reason, and you're not alone. And we need to sort of lean into that and figure out how we can get through it and how we can get the people that we lead through this. And so now I want to talk about a couple of just frameworks to help you think about this. When we think about the technical challenges that we all experience as leaders at some point in our career, these are the kinds of challenges which we know we can figure out what they are, and there probably are solutions to them, but we have to go into a search mode to find those solutions. The solutions, once we find them, can be implemented pretty quickly, and they can, pretty much fix the problem once we found them. These are hard challenges. It's not that they're easy challenges. It's just that since there is a solution out there, we just need to find it and apply it. We can do this, and we can feel pretty good that we've actually succeeded. And that's terrific. The harder challenges, though, are the adaptive challenges. And these are the challenges which are much harder to identify, and the challenges that, most importantly, there's actually not an adequate answer that exists. We have to design that answer, we have to craft that answer, and we have to do this in a way when we're not sure we're going to get it right. Also very importantly, the adaptive challenges require systemic changes. And in the case of organizations, that usually means that it requires a massive cultural change, because it's not just a very pointed solution to some technical matter that needs to be fixed. One of the examples in the literature that's often used to sort of discern technical versus adaptive challenges, and I like this one because I think it's resonant with many people, many leaders, is let us say that you have a parent who is suffering from Alzheimer's, early stage Alzheimer's, and is having a little trouble, but still is driving a car. And let us say that you go to visit this parent and you see a scratch on the car, and a dent on the car, and you ask the parent, "So tell me, please, what happened here?" And maybe the parent doesn't really remember. The technical challenge is you get the car repaired, and you sort of make it clear that the car has been repaired. But there's a much bigger adaptive challenge, obviously, in this situation, which has to do with how are you going to convince that parent that they can no longer drive? What are you going to do in terms of getting the support that is needed for that parent to help them with their beginning stage Alzheimer's and so on? So that's, I think, a nice kind of example of a technical versus an adaptive challenge. But I think probably all of you, like me, have been leading in this time and trying to toggle between these technical and adaptive challenges. And that's really what I want to talk about today, these adaptive challenges. And I want to give you the framework that we use at the Graduate School of Business in our classes, which is a leadership model that helps us think about 3 core competencies that can help us with adaptive challenges. And the first of these has to do with self-awareness, which is understanding one's own unique character in a nutshell, and understanding and spending time understanding oneself. Then there's perspective taking, which is can be called sort of interpersonal acumen and social intelligence that allows us to perceive the perspectives and needs of others and to have productive relationships as a result. And the third piece is the awareness of the context, which is being sensitive to the way in which the environmental and social context influences the interactions of the people with whom we work. And I think when we think about perspective taking right now, I think that what we really need to do is to be leaders who put empathy and compassion first as we try to discern what it is that the people with whom we work need, what their wishes are right now, and understand how what they're going through and what those wishes and needs are influencing how they are acting and interacting with others in this moment. So spending time thinking about ways to practice active listening, to listen without judgment and ask questions with curiosity, and to try to really step into the shoes of somebody else and understand what they're going through. So that means when we're talking to our Black employees or our Latinx employees or our women employees, we try to understand from their point of view how they're experiencing this pandemic. How it is that our employees who have multi-generational households are experiencing this pandemic, checking in with them constantly so we understand what it is that they are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And so, it's all, in my opinion, and our research from the GSB shows that perspective taking is an incredibly important competency for leaders. But I can't stress to you right now how important this is during these unprecedented times. When we think about the awareness of context, usually when we teach this, and we teach this model at the GSB, the awareness of the context is one that our students grapple with more. They're not exactly sure what that means. But I think what the pandemic has shown us and what these unprecedented times have shown us is that at this moment, there are so many examples of how we need to be aware of the context in which all of our interactions are taking place. And the most obvious of these, of course, is most of us are still conducting our work virtually. So what does that mean in terms of what's going on any kind of given Zoom call or webinar call? How do we make sure that everybody feels like they're included? How do we not make assumptions? I'm sure we've all been on calls with our employees where somebody's not there on video. And there's a tendency when that happens for us to assume that somebody is either checked out or multitasking or doing something else. Well, I think we need to not jump to those kinds of assumptions. Maybe somebody is not feeling well. Maybe somebody is incredibly upset because of the protests that we've been seeing, and it's affecting them in a way that they are not comfortable showing up on Zoom. We can't make assumptions about what's going on in terms of people's performance. We need to be very careful about that in this unprecedented time. I think we need to make sure that we communicate any kind of adjusted expectations about performance right now, and to, as leaders, model work-life management. And that's really hard because I think, based on some of the responses to our survey, but also based on some of the responses of what we are hearing from our leaders at Stanford and here in Silicon Valley, everybody seems to be working a lot more and at strange hours, and we're not doing a very good job collectively of modeling work-life management. I think we all need to think about ways to do that. And then figuring out how to make sure everybody feels connected. That was something that showed up in your survey. People aren't feeling connected. They need something right now. And then finally, self-awareness in unprecedented times. We need to always be practicing ways to become more self-aware and thinking about what is driving us as leaders, and what are our thoughts and feelings, and how is this impacting our relationships at work and our relationships more generally. But I think important right now, more important than ever, is creating space and time for yourself and for self-care, for making sure that you're investing in mindfulness, perhaps journaling. I know a lot of people aren't big journalers and they get turned off by the idea of journaling, but this can be an incredible way to get insight into ourselves, to reflect on how our interactions are going on Zoom or by phone or however we're interacting with our employees. Certainly asking for feedback from others can help as well, but just really embracing the need to be very self-aware at this moment. And also I want to sort of throw out there some of the research on self-awareness has been showing, very interesting research, that it's less about asking yourself the question why, and asking yourself in a very introspective way, why did this behavior go that way? Why am I feeling this way? It's more about what I can do. And so I think it's important to think about a growth mindset as a leader and thinking, okay, so let's see how those interactions went. And instead of dissecting and wondering why they went that way, think about what it is you can do to improve them going forward. Okay, I'll wrap up really quickly so we have time for some questions. Just a few last remarks on this. I think when we think about inclusive leadership in particular, and the intersection with inclusive leadership with the GSB leadership model, I think a few sort of tips to think about. Checking, and really it's a to-do list, I think, for all of us, checking in with and showing empathy toward team members who might be disproportionately impacted by this crisis, or all three crises. Taking perspective, actively taking perspective. Making virtual meetings equitable by turning on closed captions and making sure people have the materials before. We must be aware of the context in which people are working right now. Beginning meetings by acknowledging everybody who's there, not just the people who have privilege, being aware of the context in which this meeting is taking place. Begin meetings by acknowledging the challenges of the situation and checking in with employees. Again, perspective taking. These are just a few sort of thoughts on things you can do and how they intersect with the GSB leadership model. Also, showing vulnerability, I think, about your own challenges or wins that you have and asking others to share. Being self-aware enough to model what it's like to talk about some of the challenges. To start conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and race. I think it's important that we do this. Our employees want this. It's hard to do. We've noticed here, as we've been trying to do this at Stanford, that people feel more comfortable talking about gender. And when we begin to start talking about race, people become less comfortable. But providing an open space and some structured questions will help. Our people want to talk about this, and they may be clumsy doing it, but I think well-intentioned behavior and spaces will allow people to become better at this. And then finally, asking questions, perhaps anonymous and confidential, about how comfortable people are sharing, having conversations about race, and how safe they feel speaking up about incidents of bias in the organization. Again, thinking about perspective taking. Now is the time. Now we really have an opportunity now as leaders to make our organizations better as we come out of this pandemic, to build more inclusive cultures. And I think that if we begin to practice this as leaders and model this as leaders now, we will begin to allow a groundswell of openness and dialogue in our organizations, and we'll be able to, I hope, turn these unprecedented and turbulent times into an opportunity to make our organizations better.
When you think about the broader cultural context of organizations, from your perspective, what are some of the most important cultural characteristics in an organization, either positive or potentially roadblocks to a more inclusive environment at companies?
Yes, great. I love that question. One of the things that I've done some work on is thinking about changing organizational culture more broadly. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review, which was called "Changing Company Culture Requires a Movement, Not a Mandate." And it's very much about leaders signaling openness to employees to practice pilots and to see what might work. And we were really, when we wrote the piece, we were thinking about a culture of innovation and how do we create more innovative cultures in organization by allowing sort of small movements to form and for those movements to tell the stories. Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I do in my leadership role at the business school is that I oversee all of our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts there. And this is exactly the model that we have been taking, which is that we as leaders are signaling openness. We are doing a lot of things in terms of providing resources and so on for diversity. But what we're hoping and what we're trying to do is get a whole lot of small pilots going throughout the organization to build the momentum that is needed. And that's the approach that we've been taken. And so what we've been trying to do is provide the scaffolding, provide the resources, provide the platforms and so on for there to be a lot of experiments that we're then able to refine and then tell the stories about them so that we can share what it is that we've been doing with other, in our case, other universities, but certainly companies as well. And so that's sort of one piece, so way to answer that, Stephen, and I love the question. The other thing that I think is really important to right now, and I wish I could tell you how to do this because it is going to be hard. But I think one of the keys to a good and productive organizational culture, particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right now is building psychological safety. And psychological safety is a term in the organizational behavior literature that's been around for a few decades. And Amy Edmondson's written a wonderful book in the last couple of years that kind of summarizes all of this research. It's incredibly important to our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, figuring out ways to build teams that are comfortable with conversation turn taking and making sure people feel included. I think it's the heart. It's, a lot of organizations are pushing for diversity, and that's important, but we need to make sure that we are also building an inclusive teams, inclusive organizations, so that everybody can bring their full selves to work, so that we can leverage all that diversity offers us in terms of the sort of benefits of diversity.
When you think about a movement in the context of an organization and starting to see progress towards some of these inclusion goals, what do the early signs of success start to look like in an organization?
I think some of the early signs were the way in which there was an incredible alignment between all of our major constituents, students, staff, faculty, and our alums. Everybody wanted to begin to talk about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the school. And that wasn't there before. When I first came to Stanford in about 12 years ago and was wanting to do some more stuff around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the students were sort of there, the faculty were not really there, the staff was there, and the alums were not really there. And so I think one of the first things is this alignment, and that's what we've seen at the GSB that's been incredibly helpful, because that enables these experiments to begin to happen. And so we have a lot of examples of experiments which have then grown and scaled. So, one of them is our work that we've done on our case studies that are used in the classroom. So auditing them for stereotypical language, auditing them so we understand who all of the protagonists are and how to think about ways to diversify our protagonists, make sure that we have Black leaders who are covered in case studies and shown in case studies, these kinds of issues. At first, we started that and it was something concrete that people could grab onto and something that people wanted to be part of. And that's what I sort of mean, that wouldn't have happened 10 or 12 years ago. Now everybody can grab onto that. It's concrete. There's a clear outcome that we can measure. So I think having this alignment and outcomes, measurable outcomes.
Maybe just continuing on the theme of movements, there's sort of a sub question that's come from Robert, which is, if you are standing up or have stood up a task force for diversity and inclusion in an organization, what are your suggestions for some of the first steps that task force might take to create some momentum?
Yeah, that's great, Robert. It's a terrific question. I think The very first thing that, and you might have already done this, is figuring out some metrics that you can point to. You know, I think there's a sort of an adage, which is we can't change what we can't measure, or something like this. And I think it's actually really important. So one of the first things we did was, you know, first contributed, of course, to our university, which has a dashboard now about diversity. It isn't perfect, but it was a first step. But we also engaged in a lot of other measurements. So, you know, who are our guest speakers in our classroom? Super important to know that we're not getting much diversity there. It's actually been getting better over time, but being able to measure it so you had a baseline and understood where you might want to go from that. And, you know, I think ideally we would say have concrete goals. Sometimes that's a little hard. I mean, especially when, you know, our goals were anything better than this. But I think, you know, establishing metrics and then concrete goals is a really great place to start. I think the other one is classic, kind of figuring out who in the organization is willing to help and is an ally to what it is that you want to do. And they are in all kinds of interesting places. So don't make assumptions. You know, I was sort of saying don't make assumptions about your teams and where they are right now, but don't make assumptions, because you might find that there are people who are, you know, sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion advocates who you wouldn't have expected them to be. So figuring out where there are people who can help you outside of even your task force, where are people who can help shepherd ideas and convince others in ways. That's another thing that I would say is super important in the early stages. Just start Googling any of the Fortune 500 companies and look for what their leaders are saying right now, particularly about the race issue. We're doing a little research project on this right now and looking at the statements that leaders at Fortune 500 companies are saying right now, in particular about support for Black Lives Matter or generally support for their Black employees. I think right now you're in a moment where there's an opening in the opportunity to start those discussions, because it is on everybody's mind. And so pointing to this kind of obvious fact right now that this, as we come back and rebuild as a society and rebuild our organizations, we need to do that by building diversity and by attending to equity and making sure that we're building inclusion into our efforts. So you're in the perfect time to start that dialogue right now.
How do you really decide when a difficult conversation in the context of inclusion and equity might be necessary? Like with whom, in what context? Just because I think a lot of people know they need to have them, but they don't even know who they should be having these conversations with.
One of the things that we practice and we train our students in at Stanford is what we might refer to as ways one-on-one, sort of escalating disclosure is what we refer to it as. So if Stephen and I are having a conversation, I tell Stephen something a little bit about myself. I can start with oh, how are you doing, Stephen? And he says, I'm great. And I say, good, right? That's a very safe conversation. But I might then say something to Stephen like, well, I'm feeling anxious today because I'm doing this webinar for ExecOnline, and I love ExecOnline, but there might be like a couple hundred people there. And simply by expressing to Stephen that I'm anxious, it gives him the opportunity and the invitation to then disclose something about maybe how he's feeling right now. Like maybe he, is got a lot going on at the office, and he didn't really want to take an hour plus out of his time today. So by escalating a little bit, and then you can escalate a little bit more. And the point of this is that that when we disclose something, we are making an invitation to somebody to disclose something else. And as we begin to disclose a little bit more, suddenly we understand each other in a way we didn't before. And it's an extraordinarily powerful one-on-one tool that you can use with difficult conversations. And it just means being vulnerable and sharing something about how you feel in the moment. When you get to the sort of top level of this, this is what we often see with our very closest partners, spouses, family members, where we don't just disclose something about a feeling or an emotion that's in the moment, but it's about them. So it's a feeling or an emotion about our relationships. So that gets at a very high level. But there are ways in the workplace to use escalating disclosure to a point that's still professional and allows for a more safe conversation around any topic, really.
In a world where we all, as part of our full self, we have unconscious biases, we have other things that sort of contribute to a climate of maybe less than ideal inclusivity and equity. How do you balance those two things? How do you bring your whole self to work, but also recognize that your whole self might be contributing in some ways to the problem?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And I think, and Jenny, I love the question, because I think one of the things, I'm just going to talk about the unconscious bias piece of it. One of the things we know, right, is that good intentions aren't enough. And this actually goes back to what I sort of said about self-awareness, right? If you take an unconscious bias test, for example, and you realize, and by the way, I do this, I'm a working mother who was raised by a single working mother, and I still have this incredible association between men and career. That's how unconscious bias works. It's there, and But the point is, instead of asking why do I have that bias, say, okay, so what am I going to do about it? I love the analogy that sometimes you hear people say, which is that, for example, I have very bad eyesight and I wear corrective lenses. Nobody seems to think that that's odd or a problem, and that's good. I certainly would not want to be driving around my neighborhood without my glasses or contact lenses in. And I think unconscious bias is the same way. It's good to reflect on why we have these, but we really need to be thinking about, okay, then what am I going to do to block those biases? I don't spend a lot of time, wondering why I have bad eyesight. I just sort of say, okay, let me get some glasses and fix this. And so I think, and that's just that, Jenny, that's just the unconscious bias piece. And I think the answer is by bringing yourself full self to work, recognizing that and saying, well, it's my responsibility now. Good intentions are not enough. It's my responsibility now to design interventions so that I can begin to block those biases and understand it's going to be a work in process, and we will get better at it.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That is a great note to end on. We really appreciate the time you've taken with us. This has been super insightful. And as we said at ExecOnline, onward and upward. Take care.